Hello everybody, this is the last video tutorial from this project, this tiny project, and I would like to explain you in this one how to continue improving the skin, the rest of the details, and how to use the airbrush in something like that. So I hope surprise you how I work with the airbrush in a miniature like this one, because it's really tiny, so maybe a lot of you will be scared to use the airbrush on something like that. But I would like to explain you some tips to improve your skill with the airbrush and how to lose the fears. Okay? So what do you have to do now? So in the previous video you have seen how I was working to define perfectly with the dark linings, create edges, so paint some nuances, highlights to represent the volume, shapes, everything. But maybe with the previous one the model was done. So in this video tutorial, I'm going to give you something else to improve a bit else your model. So if you see, I'm trying to add some highlights in some tiny places. What kind of tiny places? Places where you have to improve the highlights. Why? Because then with the airbrush, you will bring down everything around that. And maybe with the previous contrast was okay for you. But remember, when you want to blend the brush strokes, with airbrush or with glazing, everything, you will lose a bit the contrast because you have to bring down this contrast. So if you have a low contrast, maybe at the beginning looks like nice, blended, everything looks nice, but maybe after use the airbrush to continue blending, you will lose that contrast. For that reason, I recommend you paint with more contrast, much more. So for that reason, I'm painting a new one, new layer, the last one, but this one will be just in some tiny places, maybe the highlights in some fingers or the top of the head or stuff like that. So in really tiny places. And you can see how tiny it's the highlight because it's just like a tiny dot. Why? Because you don't have enough room to continue working on that. So if you don't have more room, you don't have to add a new one because you will lose the previous one. So if you feel that you have very low contrast, try to repaint that area with something bigger and continue going up with the next layers. But if you have, for example, 10% to paint and you repaint that 10%, it's like you lose the previous layer. Okay, you have to keep something from the previous one to create the gradient. So this is the model painted. You can compare with my finger. So it's really tiny. And if you have something like that, the skin for me is done. So you don't have to blend much more there. For me, it's like blended, but I would like to bring you something better with my airbrush. So now I'm going to translate more or less the previous video tutorial and this one in this loincloth. So what do you have to do when you have to paint tiny details or smaller miniatures? The first one, paint a dark base, very dark. If you see, this is like a dark green and works perfectly with this brown. Then use the base coat to remove the 90% or more. Just keep some dark areas, dark volumes that you feel that there are shadow there, stuff like that, and the dark linings. So this outlining with a dark line should be the most important part in a tiny place, in a tiny model or tiny detail. So just with this layer, you can see that I'm removing everything and I'm trying to keep the dark lining really thin. So once time you have something like that, it's the moment to use the highlights. So you have to paint the highlights in some places. What places and how? In that case, I would like to represent this like a rope. So it's the moment to represent the texture about this rope. So with this kind of tiny dots, pop, I represent the effect from this rope. And then I've painted another highlight to represent the volume, the shape, and in some places where I feel that I need it, just that. So always the edge highlights and the top areas, just that. So once time you have done something like that, it's done. You don't have to do more. If you don't have more room to continue working on that, it's done. So it's finished. If you feel that you have enough room to continue working, add a new one, add a new highlight, or add nuances then with airbrush. But with this, in a tiny model like that, it's done. So you can blend with the 50-50 dilution, the 50-50 blending or glazing, just to blend between layers a bit, to give you more easier way to continue working with airbrush, because with airbrush we will use nuances, new colors, to change, to blend, to smooth, to change some mistakes that maybe we have, or reinforce another places. But remember, as the loincloth, it's the key. So this is the work that you have to do. If you feel that you can add a new one, as you can see here, I'm trying to add a new one. But where? In a smaller place. If I've painted 50%, now I'm going to paint 25% or 30%. So something smaller to create the gradient. If you don't have the gradient and you skip from the darkest color to the highlight, will look weird. It's much more interesting work, like you can see, with the base coat, a dark color, then the base coat with the normal color, the color that you want, then the highlight, and then another highlight in a tiny place. Just that, something like that. And now maybe the most scary moment, the airbrush. Chun, chun, chun. So you have to paint with the airbrush now. If you don't want, don't care. So don't worry. Don't try to paint with more layers or more contrast or more nuances, or with airbrush if you feel that you don't feel comfortable doing, okay? This is to enjoy, this is to have fun. You have to have fun painting models. So if you feel that you have painted 4 hours on a model, and for you with 2 hours and with the result that you have, it's enough for you, do it. You don't have to get the best results on every model, because the bar of the top or the highest level every time is changing. It's changing, sometimes it's higher, lower, changing to something new. So the bar, you will decide which one is the highest level, because will be your best level. So this is what you have to have in your mind. Enjoy painting, have fun painting, because this is the key. Once time you enjoy painting, you will get better results. And if you feel that you have to add 30 minutes else on your model, you will add it, because you know you will get better results, okay? So now the airbrush. How you have to work with airbrush? Use 90% thinner plus water, or thinner plus matte varnish. If you feel how much thinner you add, much control you will have, so less spiders you will paint on your model. How much water you add to your mix, loose control you will have, but more matte color you will have. So you can level that both levels with matte varnish maybe. So it's up to you. I usually use like 50-50, stuff like that in both. So 90% water plus thinner and 10% paint. This is to create layering, to create glazing. So this is why I work with my airbrush. You will tint in some places with nuances. You will see how I'm playing with this green, super saturated green, and now I'm using this weird magenta. So I'm using that orange, because on a green color like this one with a lot of yellow, in places where you have a lot of green, you will desaturate that green. You will change for something more like ochre or browns. And in places where you have the highlights, for that reason I said that you have to paint more highlights, in that places where you have more yellow or white, less green, you will change or turn this orange to something different. Maybe you will saturate that orange because you have yellow under that, or maybe you will change that greens to something more like ochre with yellows, so you will have different results. This is why I like play with this kind of orange and not with pure magenta. Pure magenta will be the complementary, but maybe I'm going to use pure magenta or more like violet if I have different kind of green, more bluish green, more cold green. For that kind of green, I'm going to use this kind of magenta, this orange, because you will have better control than just magenta. Magenta will be the complementary, the idea is perfect, but the result will be everything brown. So I don't want to use brown. I want to use colors that will give me more tonalities, more colors, not lose the colors. I don't want to turn everything to brown. Brown is really easy to control it. It's just mix all the colors and add magenta and you will have brown. So this is boring and I don't like it. I like play with a lot of colors. So for that reason, I use colors that will plus will give me plus or more tonalities. For that reason, for example, now I'm using this kind of blue because I would like to add darker colors in places, but I don't want to use black. So white and black is exactly the same like brown. I don't like them. I prefer create my ceilings, my roof, the caps, and I want to cross them. Or if I cross them, will be just in a tiny place. Enough tiny to bring me the light that I need, but without lose the color. So you can see the angles of the airbrush. For example, to represent the shadow, I'm flowing or spraying under the model in that angle to turn that tonalities, this base coat, to something colder and darker. And I'm going to blend my brush strokes, and I'm going to add new tonalities, and I'm going to add shadow. So I'm doing 3 steps at the same time. I don't have to create crazy mixes because I have this tool. This tool is not the devil, it's not a demon, so it's just a tool. As the same way I explain you how to work with the brush, I would like to explain you how to work with airbrush, because it's part of the key. It's something that will give you a really quick results with a nice quality, and I think once time you understand how to work with airbrush, you will love it, because it's really fancy tool. You can see how I can turn the colors on my model. If you see, you can see perfectly where I'm spraying with my airbrush, because you see like a satin effect. So it's just blow or spray one layer, dry the layer, and blow again, because it's easier paint 18 layers or glazing on that way than with your brush. With your brush you will get maybe the same result, but you will need improve your skill a lot and invest a lot of time too. So with the brush, as you see, super quick. For example, on his back, I've decided to add some shadows to create more volume on that shape. So I've decided to add this kind of tonality, and because I'm using 90% water and 10% painting, I need to add a lot of layers to have exactly the same color that I have on my cap. So it's really easy to improve the saturation, the color, to add shadows, to turn the temperature. So remember, that tool is really important and helpful to you. But once time you have painted the technical part. So for that reason, I wanted to put more effort, explain you why you have to paint the dark linings around every tiny detail as thinner as possible, and with the contrast that you need. So much more contrast than maybe when you are painting a 75 or a bust. So when you have something like that, if you use exactly the same contrast, will be okay on the dark linings. But maybe if you use less, will work on the same way, because it's something bigger. But when you have something small, really small, like a detail, you have to work on that way with a lot of contrast to create this, because then with airbrush you will blend and you will get that result, and you will lose some brush strokes, you will lose a bit of the contrast in some places, so you will have more like a smooth surface. And for that reason you need to work at the beginning with something deeper or with more contrast. So, and this is the result. So I hope you like it, because this is how I work. I work like that in a 10 millimeters, 28, 54, 75, 90, bases, everything. So this is a real true professional paint work. Okay, this is how I improve my skill with my 14 years working as painter. So this is my own way to paint, this is my method, this is how I like to paint, and I was improving my method around 14 years. So I was painting tiny models, bigger models, I know how to work on everyone. So capibases means more than just paint with thick layers, means my philosophy, means my way to work, means that you have to enjoy painting models. So here you have the result. So you don't have excuses to test them, to believe on the way. So I think the video or the photos speak by themselves. So I don't have to say that this is the best way. So this is just one way to paint. This is how I love and I enjoy painting. And here you have the result, finished. So you can compare with my finger. This is something really, really tiny that maybe with the zoom, you see maybe with some mistakes. If you see on live that model, it's really nice model, blended and really tiny. Tiny, tiny, tiny. So now what do you have to do? Once time you have finished with the airbrush, I recommend you stop here, or for the people that they want something else, paint 5% of your model again, but in that case with glazing with your brush. You will have to reinforce some dark linings or deep shadows in some places, like in that loincloth, for example, that I'm going to use inks to reinforce them and to turn the color to something more saturated, different kind of browns, stuff like that. And on his skin, for example, I'm going to use some highlights in some tiny places. So if you painted in a tiny, tiny place previously, now it's exactly the same in something smaller, but with more contrast. Just to focus the light in some places or reinforce something that maybe you lost with the airbrush. What do you think? For example, now, when you want to paint these highlights, remember, I was thinking that I told you that you have to paint with more saturated colors in the middle, and then when you are going up, you will lose the saturation because you are near to white. Maybe you said that you don't use white, but maybe you are using like ivories, pale flesh, skin tones with a lot of white. So this kind of color will desaturate the tonality. So for that reason, you will see that I'm using now this kind of green, really, really pale, but will help me to improve the light, but with less saturation. So for that reason, I recommend you use it just in a 5% on your model, no more. If you continue repainting everything, you will lose the green and the tonalities that you make it. So for example, if you see the hands, I'm going to paint just the peak or the tip of the fingers, just part of the hand, and just that. So you can see on the video tutorial, it's just tiny places. All of that with glazing, 50-50, 60-40, more like 90-10, it's up to you, just glazing. I recommend you 50-50 or a bit less, like 60% water and 40% painting, and this is the result with the highlights, with everything. So I hope you have enjoyed watching that, because it's just now add, for example, satin or glossy varnish inside of his mouth, and just that. So the project is done. So this is a 10mm miniature painting with capibases. It's just add glossy varnish like that and the project is done. So I hope you have enjoyed watching this tiny project, and I hope surprise you with the next one, because I'm working on something really excited. So thank you very much for your huge support, and see you in the next video tutorial. Bye bye!